Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and on behalf of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb, I'm delighted to welcome you to Roosevelt House, where I serve as the Jonathan Fanton Director, as most of you know. So it's good to see so many of our frequent flyers this evening, but also some guests who are here for the first time, so a special welcome to them. I'm particularly happy and proud since this event represents something of a convergence of my own worlds to see some cherished Metropolitan Museum compatriots in the house, not only Dan Weiss, but who served briefly as my boss at the Met. He had me out within weeks of his arrival, but someone for whom I worked for nearly 20 years, and that's the legendary Director Emeritus of the Met, Philippe de Montebello, who is here today. Not only are we here to celebrate an important new book, not only to explore a significant and neglected figure from a turbulent moment in 20th century history, and one who, as the book shows, opens a window onto the larger story of an American tragedy. We're doing this in a building that incubated the public life of a leader who in turn inspired the commander-in-chief of the Vietnam era. Now that may sound like kind of a facile 6 degrees of separation, an excuse to tell you about Roosevelt House, which I will indeed take, but it is valid because much of what Lyndon Johnson believed and did was absorbed from Franklin Roosevelt's ability to solve domestic problems and also conduct a great war and win a historic victory. As we know, Johnson first came to Congress at the beginning of Roosevelt's second term and made a beeline to the White House to bask in his idol's glow. So a word about this place that some of you are in for the first time, I think. It's probably created because, I haven't done the warning about cell phones yet, clearly. I will before we start the program. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were married right near the Metropolitan Museum, to add further irony, in a mother and son double townhouse. And Sarah Delano Roosevelt liked that idea, so she gave a little drawing of a double townhouse and said, "This is your Christmas and wedding present," and proceeded to build this house on 65th Street, really 2 homes, 1 door to the outside world, but 2 doors in the vestibule. And it came with a hitch. It's a free house for her son and new daughter-in-law, but she was to live on the other side of the house. So here we call it the first New Deal. Here they had their children. Franklin recovered from polio in this house because it had an unusual feature, an elevator, an interior elevator, which gave him some degree of independence. Here he trained to walk on braces. Here he conducted his campaigns for governor and his first campaign for president. He left for his inaugural from here, and he created the entire New Deal in this house. This was his transition headquarters. This modest house was the entire transition quarters, and Social Security was conceived and arranged 3 floors above where we are today. Sarah died in 1941. Eleanor wanted Hunter College, which she had begun frequenting to get away from her mother-in-law, to acquire the house. Franklin sold it for $50,000 to Hunter College in 1942. So we've had it for about 75 years. It was rehabbed and reopened as a public policy institute about a decade ago, with this wonderful little auditorium carved out of the old kitchens of the house. And here, public policy programs and undergraduate education in honor of Franklin, and human rights programs and undergraduate education dedicated to Eleanor's role in human rights are carried out. So we're happy that we have civic engagement on those issues, plus the history of the Roosevelt era, and this book fits perfectly into that, published by our longtime board member, Peter Osnos, and it even mentions Franklin Roosevelt on page 33. So we're proud to have Dan here today. As you know, as most of you know, he's the president and CEO of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He has been president, or had been president, of 2 colleges, and Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins, where he did his graduate work. Known as an administrator now, I guess, he's also a distinguished art historian, having served as the chairman of the Hopkins History of Art Department and having written several previous books on medieval art. I think you have to be medieval or a medievalist to run the Met, but that's another story. We are delighted to welcome him to discuss In That Time, Michael O'Donnell and the Tragic Era of Vietnam. I guess it takes a Dean of Arts and Sciences to interview one, so we have recruited Hunter's own Andy Polsky for that task. Dean Polsky, who is also a professor of political science at Hunter, is the author of several books, including one highly relevant title, Elusive Victories, the American Presidency at War. He also edited a book about the Eisenhower presidency, in which arguably America's military involvement in Southeast Asia began 65 years ago. So just a bit of housekeeping. Do silence your phones because we're taping this for our own website and for our YouTube channel that will be broadcasting live. After a discussion of about 40 minutes, we will have some time for audience questions, during which we will ask you to wait for a microphone, again for recording. And then we will move upstairs 2 floors above to the first floor for a reception in Dan's honor and a book signing where you may and you must get your inscribed copy of In That Time. So now, please join me in welcoming Andy Polsky in conversation with Dan Weiss.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to have a nice conversation about a fascinating book. And I'm going to begin actually with a couple of writer questions before we get into the substance of it. Let's start at the beginning. When did you begin the project that became In That Time? And why did you want to write about Michael O'Donnell?
Well, this project started a long time ago. It's a small book, but it had a long history. I first encountered the story of Michael O'Donnell and its basic elements when I was looking through a book called The American Century by Harold Evans, probably known to many of you. I was just leafing through the book, and there was a section on the Vietnam War, and within that section, there was a poem written by a young man who was a soldier and helicopter pilot in Vietnam that I found very moving. And it is, the poem is in the book and, in fact, at the center of the story. And the last stanza of the poem says, "And in that time, when men decide and feel safe to call this war insane, don't forget those gentle heroes you left behind." And I was very struck by the message he was conveying. This young man understood there was something very important about distinguishing between those who fought this war in order to enact political policies they had nothing to do with, and the consequences of being treated, as we all, those of us who lived through the 60s know, that these soldiers were held to account for policies they had nothing to do with because they fought the war as they were asked to. I was struck by the poem, and it said below the poem, there was a brief statement in Harold Evans' book, that this was written by Michael O'Donnell, a young helicopter pilot. His helicopter was shot down several months after he wrote this poem, and he remains missing in action. The time I read this, that was the account. I got curious as to who was this young man, why did he write this poem, and I began just to accumulate information. The first thing I did, I promise you this will not take the whole time to answer your question.
No, it's fine.
The first thing I did was I understood that that poem, which had become very famous even by the time I had read it, it appears in many different places and on monuments around the United States, was first appeared in a letter to his very best friend, Marcus Sullivan. They were songwriters together. They were kids in the 60s, folk singers, college kids. They loved each other. They were dear friends. And Michael wrote this letter with this poem in it to his best friend. So I tracked down his best friend, Marcus Sullivan, to talk with him. And I wanted to just know, tell me about your friend. I didn't know where this project would go. I wasn't thinking of a book. I think in the first instance, I wanted to respond to this young man's request in the poem to try to remember who this guy was. And Marcus and I hit it off and I met with him, and he had lots of information, a remarkable man. And he helped me to understand Michael and helped me gather information about Michael. He became my partner in learning more about him. And this was some years ago 15 years ago. We gathered a lot of information. I put it in a file with the idea that I would write a book about this at some point, and my career intervened. But Marcus remained a close friend and helped me with this project all along. This book is as much about Michael as it is about a friendship. And as it happens, Marcus Sullivan is here tonight and remains a dear
If you don't
friend.
mind, stand up, please. Welcome.
If it wasn't for Marcus, I wouldn't have been able to do this book. But once the story was in my head, it persisted until the project was completed.
A couple of also stay on the theme of writing about Vietnam, because many of us in the room are of that generation, either old enough to have served or young. We certainly were affected by it. I was active in the anti-war movement myself at that time, and I've spoken to other writers about this. It is hard for us to write about the war with any sense of distance or detachment, and I'm curious whether or not you found that to be a problem or how you approached the challenge of writing about the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Well, most of my scholarship has really been devoted to the Middle Ages. So much of what I've written about happened a millennium ago. This is a very different proposition. But one reason I was motivated to do this book was because I'm old enough to remember this war. I was just young enough to not worry about the draft. But as all of us who lived through that time know, every single night on television there was the news about the war and the film footage of the helicopters and the battles. And there was something in my mind, even in the 6th grade, that one followed enough of public events to understand, even as a middle schooler, that there was something powerfully wrong with a war that was so completely at odds with public opinion. It was clear that the policies that were being developed to enact this war, to motivate this war, were not clearly understood or even wrong. And later, so as I returned to this, I have the detachment of many decades, but I was curious to understand something in my youth I didn't understand. Like, how did this happen? Why is it that how did this war come about that resulted in this sort of consequences? So it's a very different kind of intellectual exercise than writing about the Crusades. But I had enough detachment, I think, to write a book that felt to me as though it was a historically worthwhile exercise.
As you pointed out, it's taken time for this project to reach fruition. It took a number of years. Wisely, you didn't quit your day job as you were doing this.
Right.
I'm curious if the book that finally emerged is what you thought you would be writing when you started. Did it change at all along the way?
It did, and I think for most writers, a project like this, historical inquiry, will evolve with increased information and insight into the subject. I began with great curiosity and interest in this young man who was, in many ways, it was clear to me early on that his story was in some ways exemplary of what happened to our country in the 1960s and how this nation lost its way. And in studying his story, in many ways, it helped me understand what happened to our country. So I knew that I wanted to tell the story on several levels. There's a human interest story about a young man of enormous appeal and who was an engaging and beloved friend to people, who had this tragic set of experiences, and who wrote poetry at the same time that helped us to understand his spiritual views, his mental views, his life experience of the war. I knew at one level I wanted to write a human interest story, but I thought that there also needs to be an overlay of the historical context in which all of this happened. So how did what Lyndon Johnson do relate to what happened to Michael O'Donnell? And in so doing, in trying to weave those stories together, I could help the reader understand and appreciate that policy decisions have consequences of brutal immediacy to those who have to live them. And we all hear on the news one day, Michael O'Donnell's helicopter was shot down and he's missing in action. And that's it, we move on. But everyone in this story did not move on. And 50 years later, they have not moved on because their lives were extraordinarily shaken by this experience. So I wanted to tell that story and the Vietnam American story at the same time. After a while, it was clear to me that this book needs to be a short book. This man did not have a long life. He died at the age of 24. He's a historically interesting figure, but he was a kid. And I wanted to try to tell the story in a way that was proportional to his life experience, but also that wove together big issues around the war. And finally, my goal then was, how do I tell the story in a way? I wanted to write it for people who are interested in that period, who would be interested in this young man, but who are not scholars of the Vietnam War. There are lots of books on Vietnam. or scholars on the issues of public policy in the 1960s, or the social folk music movement. I wanted to weave all those together to tell a human interest story in the context of the 1960s. And then the design presented itself to me with the actual rescue moment when Michael's helicopter was shot down is right in the middle of the book. And that seemed right, given the story I was trying to tell.
So let's get into the substance of the book, and let's turn to Michael O'Donnell. Who was he before he went to Vietnam?
So he was a middle-class kid who grew up in Shorewood, Wisconsin, a suburb of Milwaukee. He was charismatic, charming, beloved. He early on in high school became very interested in folk music, like lots of kids in the early 1960s. He was interested in songwriting and poetry. He was an enduringly mediocre student. He was not interested in school. He was interested in social activity and his music. And he then went to college at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, where he met Marcus. And the two of them decided that they became very close friends immediately and started making music together. They made an album together with some other friends. They were quite accomplished. They were writing and performing their own music. And they were on their way to what could have been a very meaningful career in music. They performed in Old Town Chicago in the summers. And so he thought of himself as a musician and a poet. And the Vietnam War intervened for both of them. And he then became a soldier, which is another part of the story. But he was in many ways all of us. He was just a kid who was born at that time in America and found his way into the war haplessly.
Although, to be clear, he was a volunteer, and we should recognize that.
Yes.
But why did he volunteer?
So as in the 1964, 1965, as following the Tonkin Gulf Resolution and the rise of the draft and the increased numbers of young people who were being drafted, everyone around Michael was being drafted. At the same time, he was caught up in his music such that he wasn't doing very well in college, and he decided to take some time away from college, and to appease his parents, he went to community college for a year. And it became clear to him that everyone around him, that the war was engulfing the world that he lived in. And he had the idea that if he were to enlist, then he would control his destiny. And this a lot of people did at that time, that to be drafted is to be called upon to do what you're told to do. But he thought he would become a helicopter pilot. He had heard about this from a high school friend, and that if he could do that, it takes so long to learn how to fly a helicopter that by the time his training would be completed, the war would be over, because wars last 4 years. That's what he thought, because that's how it was for people who, before Vietnam. And of course, that's not how it played out for him, but that's why he did it. Right after he enlisted, Marcus was drafted. And Marcus made the decision to just go ahead and be drafted and go to the war. And he went to the war for 1 year as a combat engineer and came home. Marcus was still training to fly a helicopter. Michael was. But that's why he enlisted at the time.
He went to Vietnam in the fall of 1969. That's when his turn came. Remind us of what the situation was there at that time, so we can appreciate what the troops faced.
Well, by 1969, the war, public opinion about the war was consonant with the actual experience of the war, and everyone could see that by that time the war was a failure. It was not realizing the policy objectives that had been outlined by Lyndon Johnson. Richard Nixon was at the time trying to wind down the war and using the term of peace with honor. Everyone who fought in Vietnam, every single person who fought in Vietnam by 1969 knew that the war was, as Larry Heinman said, a shuck. That is to say, these guys felt that they had been conned, and they were in Vietnam trying to uphold a military policy that wasn't going to be successful. So at the time Michael went, he had been following these events nationally. Obviously the protest movement was swirling around everybody at that time. And his goal, like every other soldier's goal, was to survive. Just get there, take care of each other, and come home. But there was no idealism, no ambition to achieve any political or military victories. It was just to survive. And he knew that at the time he left, and he wrote poems about that, even en route in the airplane to Vietnam in October of 1969.
When he was in Vietnam, what kind of service as a helicopter pilot was he performing?
He was assigned to the 170th Assault Helicopter Unit, and he elected to fly what's called a Slick. These were Hueys, the basic helicopter of the war, the iconic image of the war. There were two kinds of Hueys. There were gunships, and there were what are called Slicks because they didn't have guns on them. So what he did is he never fired a shot in Vietnam. His helicopter missions were to fly soldiers in and out of battle or to do rescue missions. And that's what he did every day. And it was a very unusual life to be a soldier in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot. His base was a little bit removed from the front lines. Most of the time they had hot water and showers. So he'd get up in the morning and have a shower and have breakfast and put on his uniform and go into the war and watch people die and rescue them. And then, as he wrote in one poem, the end of the day I'd come back to the base and have to use my hose to wash all the blood out of the back of the helicopter. And tomorrow I will wake up and do exactly the same thing. And he wrote about what that was like. But it was a surreal existence. They'd come back to the base, they would take off their uniforms, and they would spend the evening eating and drinking and whatever. Then the next day, same thing. So he used his time in the evenings after he was settling in Vietnam to write his poems about the war. His friends were all in the bar doing what they did, and he was writing about this experience. And most of these poems recount what that was like for him, his interior experience of watching people die every day.
What function would you say that the writing poetry served for him, and who was his audience?
It's a really interesting question because in many ways the poetry movement in the Vietnam era was a lot like the British soldiers in World War I, where there was this, for reasons that have to do, I guess, with the intractability of the conflict they were called upon to fight. And if you were doing trench warfare in World War I, there was a certain inevitable sense that you're not going to survive that experience either. And in Vietnam, there were many soldier poets who engaged in this kind of work because they had nowhere else to express how they felt. They recognized they were fighting in a cause that was not supported by the American people. They were not heroes at all. They were vilified. Many of them knew they weren't going to survive the war, and they were called upon one way or the other to express themselves, and they used poetry. So as I say in the book, there was this great movement of poetry in this time. Not all of the poetry rises to the level of the highest level of poetry, but it's powerful human expression of despair and conflict and what it felt like to them. And for Michael, who was a songwriter before that, he was writing about girls and, the kind of things kids write about when you're 24 years old or 22 years old and there's nothing wrong in life. He turned his attention to writing poetry because it was a way for him to express the rage and the fear and the despair that he felt. And it was a creative outlet for that. His colleagues in Vietnam knew he was writing poetry, and they were really grateful to know. They didn't follow him. He didn't read his poetry to them every night, but they knew he was doing it, and it meant a great deal to them because they knew somehow somebody's telling our story. Here we are in this outpost in the middle of nowhere in Con Tum, North Vietnam, surrounded by the enemy, flying these missions every day, some of us dying every day. And nobody knows and nobody cares. So Michael felt that he was, in some ways, telling all of their story, and that's why he did it, I think.
I want to pause for a moment, actually, to read a poem, one of his poems, because I want the audience should have a flavor of what he wrote. I don't, as a rule, get to do public poetry readings. In fact, this is the very first one I've ever done, so bear with me. Each of us is a can of tomato paste. And though we may all not have the same label as we spin through the air, when we land too hard or get torn from the outside or within, we spill out and stain the hands of everyone who knew us. It's not light stuff.
No, it's not light stuff, and if one compares it to his songs before the war, it's a very different kind of character. He was exploring what it meant to have the experience that he had, and he was trying to use this creative outlet to do that. Many of his poems are sad in that way, and they're very moving. The last poem he ever wrote, which was, if I may, maybe, you read a poem, I'll read a poem.
Please.
Okay. He wrote this poem just a few days before he flew the mission that resulted in the end in his death. And by this time, it was clear to him. It was clear to him he would not survive the war. That the odds were not in favor of what he was seeing and what he was perceiving. And so just a few days before he died, he wrote the following poem. I have tasted the air in the early morning, before the sun and before the day. I have let it run all down my face and stain my clothes, and I have learned to wash myself with the part of the day that remains. I am dying in the sun at Dak To. I am each day becoming less interested in the way the morning tastes, and I am dying in the sun at Dak To, and I am dying in the sun at Dak To. He was 24 years old, reflecting on the world he lived within, and 5 days later he had died.
Tell us a little about how he passed. Tell us about his death.
Yeah. So at this very center of this story is the mission that ultimately cost him his life. And Michael was flying in a unit of a group of helicopters, and it was a very complicated process that these helicopter pilots followed in order to conduct the missions that they were called upon. And on March 26th, there was a special operations group. What they were doing is that their job was to fly these special operations group commandos, typically a group of 3 or 4 Americans, and then 5 or 6 or 7 Montagnard commandos, so groups of maybe 8 or 10 of them, secretly fly them into enemy territory, in this case, Cambodia, March of 1970. We weren't in Cambodia yet. Remember, Richard Nixon announced that we were going to go into Cambodia in April, and that's what led to the Kent State riots in early May. So in March, these guys were flying into the enemy territories in Cambodia. And this special operations group was behind enemy lines, and they were they were under attack and being chased by the enemy. So Michael's unit was called upon to rescue them. And in order to conduct a rescue mission like that, it takes about 11 or 12 aircraft to do this. A handful of helicopters, some of them gunships that would fly to the rescue area, and they would fire in the area surrounding where these soldiers are. And then the Slicks, the helicopter Michael was flying, would land somewhere and take these guys on board and fly away. There were fixed-wing aircraft also flying in the sky, including on all of these missions, there was a slow-flying propeller plane way up in the sky watching everything. They were just there all the time, following the mission, and they would talk to the commandos and tell them what to do. It was kind of a remarkable choreographed event. In this case, these commandos on the ground had very little time left. All those helicopters were hovering above. The mission commander of that mission was a guy named Jim Lake, and they were running out of fuel as they were waiting. So a group of them had to go back to the base to get fuel, and he said, Jim Lake did, to O'Donnell, you stay here in your helicopter with 2 gunships, monitor the situation, we'll be right back. It'll take us about 15 minutes to get there and 15 minutes back, and nothing's happening. The commandos aren't at the landing zone yet. And then things accelerated while those guys were away getting fuel, and O'Donnell was the only one on site by the time these commandos had nowhere to go. So they radioed up and said, if we don't get rescued, we will die right now. So Michael O'Donnell said on the radio, I will get them right now, by himself. So he, in his helicopter with his crew, there were 3 other men on that helicopter. And they went down into the jungle beneath the canopy of trees into this ravine without any protection, and they sat on the ground for 4 minutes, which is a very long time to be sitting under enemy fire in a helicopter, while these commandos made their way to the helicopter. As this was happening, Jim Lake and his crew, all the helicopters were coming back on site, but there's nothing they could do by this time. The drama was being enacted. So they just hovered in the space, and Lake was very upset because he was the one who should have been on the ground risking his life, not O'Donnell. And O'Donnell did this. They got on the helicopter, and as they was rising out, his last words were, I've got them all, I'm coming out. And he got to about 200 feet in the air, and the helicopter was fired at. They were in a valley as they were flying through the valley and gaining altitude. The helicopter was shot, and it flew another 200 yards forward and then into the jungle and blew up in flames. And so Jim Lake and the crew, they were all sitting there watching this. So they tried to attempt to rescue or at least to identify what happened, but there was so much enemy fire in the area that after doing a few quick reconnaissance flybys to see if they could get close, and they could not, there were flames in the jungle where the helicopter had crashed. Jim Lake gave the command to all the aircraft, leave the site, back to base, we're going to just go. And Jim Lake was 19 years old. So, the legacy for him, is, as he has said in this book, every single day since that happened in March of 1970, every single day he wakes up with that on his mind. And as he said in an interview to Marcus and to me when we visited with him, I should have been the one who died that day. And I live with that every day. So Michael was left in the jungle. They could not go back and search because we weren't legally in Cambodia yet. There was no official way to do that. So the soldiers went back, and the site was abandoned. and recovered in 1998. That's another part of the story.
Right. We'll come to that in a moment. But tell us how his poetry came to be known, because up to this point, it's totally unknown, and he has just been killed in action.
The poetry was known primarily to Marcus because Michael sent it to Marcus in letters. And after Michael died, of course, his crewmates had to open his footlocker and gather up his materials to send back to his family. In that group, as they were going through the materials, there was a British journalist named Brian Benton who asked, everybody wanted to take these poems. They were very moving. They all just stopped what they were doing and read them. And quickly they circulated all over the base. And Brian Benton, this British journalist, took them back with him to London when he left that area a year later. And eventually, within another year or two, those poems were published in the UK first. 14 of them were published in a British newspaper. And then they became very, very well known. And they were spread all over, and Michael's poetry became very well known, particularly to soldiers. And thereafter, his poetry became known to others, and it is now, for example, it's very widespread, and even in the early 1970s, most people were familiar with his poetry, but that's how it started.
He was listed originally as missing in action. How was his case finally resolved?
Well, he was listed as missing in action, so 3 or 4 days after the helicopter was shot down, the O'Donnell parents were visited by a military officer with the telegram telling them he was missing in action. 4 days later, they delivered another telegram telling him that we don't know the outcome of your son's situation, but we cannot search, and it's not clear at all that he survived. It's a heartbreaking telegram. In the event we have additional information, it will be disclosed to you post haste. But in the meantime, please do not share this information with anyone, because it might just all technical, devastating news that was presented in this sort of military way. He was then listed as missing in action for many, many years, and in 1978, the family decided to request that his status be changed to killed in action because they had not encountered a single bit of evidence, not one, from the time he was shot down until 1978, that he could possibly be alive. But part of this saga is that the military feels this burden of responsibility to the families of missing in action, and so they communicate regularly with the family. Dear Mr. and Mrs. O'Donnell, a Caucasian male was identified on the streets of Saigon resembling your son. An investigation is underway. 3 months later, we're sorry that was a false lead. This went on for years. So in 1978, the family said, we know he's dead, just let's declare him killed in action. But there was no other news. Both of Michael's parents died before they knew any more than what they learned in those 2 telegrams. And in 1998, evidence was surfaced of where the crash site was, and the American government spends very substantial resources to relocate the dead of all wars, but particularly Vietnam and World War II, so the site was excavated. And his remains were found. That's all detailed in the book. Very complicated process of archaeological investigation and DNA analysis at a cost of millions. On average, the repatriation of military remains from Vietnam is about $1.7 million per lost soldier. That's what it costs to do this work. But they did find evidence. They found the crash site, and they were able to identify Michael and his colleagues. And they were buried ceremoniously at Arlington Cemetery 2 weeks before 9/11. So this story had a long tail.
The latter part of the book, in which you recount much of this, is also about your view of how the United States reacted after the end of the war to that experience. Do you think the country's response was a fair, sensible response? I get the sense that there's a dissatisfaction in your mind about the way America dealt with the experience.
Well, I think there's a great deal to learn from the Vietnam War that we all thought we learned before the events of recent years in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we've had protracted wars of questionable validity. In Vietnam, during the course of the war, it became increasingly clear to everyone that the policies that motivated the war in the first place were questionable. Will this limit communism if we're able to somehow constrain Ho Chi Minh and what's happening in the north in Vietnam? All of those premises were clearly poorly understood, and I outlined some of this in the book. How is it that the best and the brightest, these people who worked for Lyndon Johnson and before that John F. Kennedy, could not figure out what Ho Chi Minh was really about? And it wasn't about the advance of communism. So in any case, I think that was the first major mistake. After the war, it was clear that it was such a devastating national tragedy and trauma, and I outline this as well, that the American people wanted to move on. There was just, by the early 1970s, by the mid-1970s, there was just very little tolerance for any discussion or analysis. But then slowly and organically, that wasn't a satisfactory approach because there were too many people walking the streets of the United States who had been devastated by this war. So these stories started to emerge in various ways, and scholars began to write about it. Francis Fitzgerald, David Halberstam, and then came the accounts of Philip Caputo and Michael Herr and all the others who lived through the war. I think that there were many fits and starts in how we came to terms with that. Where I have a strong point of view is that I think it was clear to the American military establishment fairly early on that there were profound injuries inflicted on those who fought in this war that we did not understand. That is post-traumatic stress disorder. And the American military did not step up to figure out what is this about. They did not mobilize resources to understand why so many American Vietnam vets were suffering suicides and illness and all kinds of challenges because, in a sense, everybody wanted to move on. And I outline in the book my own view that there's an ethical issue here. If young men and women are healthy and able to sacrifice their lives on behalf of the nation, and you're willing to spend millions on weapon systems and training and uniforms and helicopters and all of that, where are the resources for them after they have been damaged and they return home and they're homeless and they have drug problems and they have medical issues that are intractable? Where's the investment there? And that is still a problem. If you look at the VA today and what is happening to those soldiers from Vietnam and Iraq, from Iraq and Afghanistan, it's not a radically different story. And ultimately, I think that's an ethical issue for our leaders to contend with. And I outline that.
I want to add a personal note here. We visited Vietnam, my wife and I, back in 2012 after I wrote my book. In Vietnam, by the way, it's called the American War. And they, too, have trouble dealing with this historical episode. When they teach about the American War in Vietnam in their universities, it's not taught by their history departments. It is taught by their departments of Marxism-Leninism. It is still too sensitive a political subject for them to wrestle with it openly, and my experience in talking to Vietnamese students and faculty made it clear that there were issues, dimensions of the war that they still were not prepared to talk about.
Well, it's, I think, important to remember that the devastation that we suffered was extraordinary, and the devastation the Vietnamese suffered was exponentially more so, that the country was effectively destroyed. Millions were killed. We dropped more bombs on Vietnam during that war than we dropped throughout the entire history of the Korean War and World War II combined. And so the suffering and the trauma that they suffered was extraordinary.
And yet I want to say also at the same time, Americans are very welcome in Vietnam. People are very happy to see Americans. They still don't like the French. But Americans are, and they really don't like the Chinese, I can say that, but the Americans are popular there. Let me ask one last question before we open it up. You suggest, if I'm reading you correctly, that there is something particularly tragic about Michael's fate. And I'm wondering, would it have made a difference if Vietnam had been, quote, a good war?
Well, I think ultimately all loss of human life is tragic, particularly when it occurs in those kinds of contexts. Everyone who died in the Second World War was a tragic loss, but at least one could understand the context in which that sacrifice was being made. And in the case of Vietnam, I was very struck in my research by, I came across a recording of a conversation that Lyndon Johnson had with Mac Bundy, and he was saying, you know, Mac, getting into this war is going to be it's a terrible thing. It's not going to go anywhere. There can be no good outcome. It's going to be a disaster. And at the time he said that, 4,000 Americans had died. And then there were 54,000 more Americans to die before they could face up to the reality of that statement. And so I think those tragic losses are perhaps more painful to endure, particularly for the families. It's one thing to have sacrificed your child for a cause that meant something, but this didn't mean anything. So I do think there was a difference. And in Michael's case, I don't believe his own personal experience was dramatically different from that of other young soldiers, but he wrote about it, and he provided us an opportunity and a window into his soul, into his experience. That, combined with the fact that he had this sublime friendship with Marcus Sullivan, allowed me to understand something about what happened to this young man so that I could explore my own questions in ways that otherwise... One other thing to say about this, many people who had some experience of Vietnam who read this book said, it's a very powerful story. It's one of a lot of stories. And that's exactly right. This is not a singular story. It's just this book's story. But there are 58,000 books like this, 58,000 stories just about what happened to Americans in Vietnam. And that's partly what I wanted to explore in this book. What does it mean to understand loss? What really is that about for the people around, for everyone? So, anyway.
Thank you. Let's open this up to questions from the audience, and I will just ask that you wait for the microphone when I call on you, and that you may make a comment, of course, but please end with a question. Thank you, thank you. Let's start over here. Wait for the mic.
Thank you for this beautifully written book. I just finished reading it. Michael is such an appealing person, and I think because he reminds me so much of some of the people in my infantry platoon who wanted to get out of the house, off the block, and into a job that paid something and might lead somewhere. And I think that makes the tragedy of his death especially painful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Come around over here.
I'm very touched by the story because my cousin was killed in Vietnam. He flew a chopper on reconnaissance missions. He was there only for 6 months, and he got shot down 6 months before his 22nd birthday. Having said that, I've never been able to read anything about Vietnam or seen any movies on the topic. I'd like to backtrack your research, and I'm sure it's quite extensive. What was the influence of the Cold Warriors and the digression that occurred after World War II and all the wars up to and including World War II, which were considered winnable wars because you had clear-cut winners and losers? That digression occurred after World War II, two unwinnable wars, namely Korea, which we did not win, Vietnam, and Afghanistan and Iraq, and future wars to be named.
Yes, well, I'm very sorry for your loss. It's what this story is about. I do my best in this book. I did a lot of reading and to try to understand what these issues were about. And as I said, there's a lot written about the Vietnam War and military strategy and the helicopter war and all of that. But I think in essence, the gist of it is, we know how to, the American people, the American military knew how to win wars. We always won wars. World War II is a great case in point. And then Vietnam came along. It's a very different proposition. What are we winning? There was the military strategy was search and destroy. So the American military would go to a place and engage in a battle and do their very best to accumulate casualties. Then they'd leave. And then the enemy would repopulate that place, and that would be that. And the idea was General Westmoreland was responsible in the first instance for developing this strategy under Lyndon Johnson and McNamara. Wear these people down. We have so much firepower. We're going to intimidate them. For every one American who dies, there will be 20 Vietnamese who die. These people will not withstand that kind of firepower. And the mistake was that the Vietnamese thought they were fighting for something very different than the political ideology of communism. They thought they were fighting about unifying their country and the right to self-determination, a little bit like the American Revolution. And as a result of that, they were willing to accumulate those casualties, and therefore the military strategy developed by the Americans did not work. And so over time, as our own casualties accumulated, the war of attrition had an effect on the American people and the American government. So Westmoreland's strategy worked brilliantly for the Vietnamese. It did not work well for the Americans. And I think the same issues obtained in Afghanistan and Iraq. When you're fighting a battle of counterinsurgency and you're not fighting in conventional ways for territory and obvious indicators of victory, it's very difficult to know how to fight. And all that firepower doesn't make that much difference. That was the lesson, I think.
And having written a book on that very subject, I'm not going to give an extended answer to this. I'll make one brief comment. Within the larger decision that's made, there are also lots of smaller decisions. Michael O'Donnell was flying a rescue mission to pick up a reconnaissance team that had been sent into Cambodia in advance of the invasion of Cambodia that Richard Nixon planned in 1970. The invasion was one of several episodes in which Nixon tried to demonstrate that if he was strong enough and forceful enough, he could secure better terms from the North Vietnamese than would have otherwise been possible. And the net result of the invasion of Cambodia was the eruption of protest again in the United States. The anti-war movement had actually been at a low ebb right before that. And as far as its impact on the war, Creighton Abrams, who was the American commander in 1970 in Vietnam, looking back at the invasion of Cambodia, concluded that, in his own words, it imposed some small inconvenience on the communists. I think there was a question, hand up in the back. So, well, let's go, and the far back, if you don't mind, because... No, further back. Keep all the way back.
I'm in the peanut gallery. I'm coming from a small country in Europe.
Keep the microphone close to your mouth.
Yeah, sorry. I'm coming from a small country in Europe called Luxembourg, a country which was rescued from the Nazis by American and other Allied troops. And early on, I was interested in understanding what has happened in Vietnam. I have read many books, a few conclusions, if you allow, and then a question. One, it's a kind of wars which are won after the foreign troops leave. Two, as John Paul Vann said, when asked by Dane Rusk, in 1967 the war will be over, and he rendered, no, Mr. Secretary of State, we'll be able to hold on longer than that. So I think it goes in the direction of what you said. Thirdly, for me, the Vietnam War is like Europe's World War I. The same social consequences which have not gone away until today. Thirdly, fourthly, I think it's also the beginning of what I would say is the weakening of the liberal international order. It started in Vietnam. There was a moment in the early 90s, after the end of the Cold War, where something could have been done, maybe, to, for example, bring Russia into the European Union. This was not done.
Can I ask you to come to your question, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
But I want to mention this because I believe it's part of the question of the story. My question to you is, what are the lessons which were learned from Vietnam in terms of, say, Afghanistan or Iraq? Are we in the same kind of position? Are we fighting on the wrong side? Which I think seems to be one of the... Are we the puppets of the puppets, as Sun Tzu would have said 2,500 years ago? What are the lessons learned?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this is a subject about which a great deal is written by military experts, of which I am not. But I will give you my own view, and that is, I think, any time a government is to commit its people to war, there needs to be a thorough and careful consideration of exactly what the purpose of that strategy is, and to think through all alternatives, not just the idealistic one, and to understand what the implications are, because once you begin a war, ending them is very hard. So I think in the first instance, and we made this mistake again in Afghanistan, even if it was a right war, and in Iraq, what is the strategy going to be, and what's going to happen under various scenarios? And in Vietnam, those were not carefully considered. There was a certain kind of immediate conclusion that we have to contain communism. This was something that Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon all agreed to. But this strategy did not actually help to realize the containment of communism. But there wasn't careful consideration of all of there was a kind of groupthink that went on, certainly among the best and the brightest. Like, why are the Vietnamese fighting in the first place? How willing are they to sacrifice in service of whatever that ambition is? So I think one has to be very hard-headed in really thinking through there's a moral issue about committing others to sacrifice their lives in service of a decision you've made, and I think we've taken that very lightly, certainly in my lifetime, and I think that's morally reprehensible. So that's the first instance. But if you're going to do it, be prepared, really be prepared that once you start this fight, you understand all the possible military scenarios that might play out. We absolutely didn't do that for any of these wars. We committed because there was an exigent circumstance to do so in the near term, and then we had to figure out what the hell to do now that we're here. And I don't think that's the right way to advance a military strategy.
One lesson that the Army learned after Vietnam was they didn't want to fight any more counterinsurgencies. They basically threw away the books on counterinsurgency and said, this is not a kind of war we ever want to fight. So when we ultimately did have to fight that war again, they essentially had to reinvent whatever techniques they were going to use to fight that war, not very successfully.
Exactly.
Other questions? Come up here. Wait for the mic.
You've mentioned the best and the brightest in David Halberstam, and his book, entitled that, gave the impression that if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, the war might not have gone as it did. Do you have any comment on that?
I do. We can all speculate on what might have been, but my own view is based on the materials that I've read and what I know about Kennedy as a decision maker. It's highly unlikely he would have escalated the way Johnson did, and the circumstances around which Johnson's decisions are in many ways kind of uniquely circumstantial. So I don't believe we would have had Vietnam in anything like the circumstances we did if Kennedy had lived. He was much too cautious, he was much too political, and he learned so much from the Bay of Pigs. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was a better example of the kind of ways he resolved conflict. So I think the evidence we have is such. He was also better at listening to his advisors than Johnson was. So I believe that one of the most consequential crimes of the 20th century was Lee Harvey Oswald, because it did change everything.
Okay. Any other questions? Before we conclude, I just wanted to wonder if, Marcus, if you wanted to say anything before we ended tonight, since we have you here. Can we ask you to just wait for the microphone?
I went from singing protest songs with Michael to being drafted and being in Vietnam. And this was 67, late 67, and I was there through Tet of 68 as a combat engineer. And the war by that time, we were all acutely aware that the war was very unpopular back home because we'd been back home. We were the people back home. And so when I got to Vietnam, I was given a kind of humorous poster. It was blank. It was drawn on, but it was Beetle Bailey, the cartoon character, the soldier. And he was running across Vietnam, and each of his footsteps were numbered from 365 down to 1. And so Vietnam was a countdown war for us. It was a war that you would cycle through. And that's not the kind of war when people are fighting for a cause. If you're fighting for a cause, you're not counting the days down to get out. Another thing that occurred to me just recently, there was another book published on the music of Vietnam. And it's called We Gotta Get Out of This Place, which was the #1 song by the Animals that we listened to. And there were a lot of other music involved in that. But that, again, is not a thing that speaks of a cause, a winnable cause. And so Michael knew that. And one of his shortest poems is about the countdown. He was there in October, and he was just getting his feet on the ground, and mostly he was in the air. But his poem in its entirety is October has limped away on David Fallon's one good leg. So he had a friend who was wounded and was cycled out of the war. He got to go home. But it was that kind of experience And so Vietnam was a curious, curious thing. And I was back home by the time Michael went, as Dan pointed out so nicely in the book and tonight. Michael thought that the war would be over if he bided enough time, went to officer training school, helicopter training school, and some infantry training. But it didn't work out that way. Wars are not 4 years. They're, as we know full well from Afghanistan, they're much longer than that. And wars are always easy to start. They're very difficult to finish.
Thank you. Thank you. Please.
Just since we're talking about war poetry this evening, and the Vietnam in particular, as I read a lot of this material and I immersed myself in the poetry of the war, the most profound poet from that period, in my view, is a poet named John Balaban, whose work in this area is extraordinary. And he's here this evening as well. So I just wanted to thank him for being here.
Thank you all for coming this evening. The book signing and the reception will be upstairs. Please join me once more in thanking our guest.